science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. If you are a regular listener to this podcast, you will know that mostly I try and have cross-disciplinary conversations. But today is one of those days where I'm having an unusual conversation in that I'm speaking to a recent graduate of architecture, Mohamad Nahleh. He has just graduated from MIT School of Architecture and originally from Beirut. Mohamad Nahleh did a fascinating thesis where he tracked a journey through the night and built a series of monuments in the landscape of Beirut as a singular way of indexing life history and contemporary thinking. I hope you enjoy it. I enjoyed recording this very much. Here we go. Welcome to Architecture Talk, Mohamad. Mohamad Nahleh.
Yes.
Is that how you say your last name?
I mean, it's Mohamad Nahleh, but I appreciate and recognize the Americanized version of the name. It's fine.
Let's try Mohamad Nahleh.
Yes, that's much better.
Bit better. And you are a recent grad from MIT's Masters of Science in Architectural Studies.
Precisely.
And Mark Jarzembek spoke extremely highly of you, and we've spoken a few times. And you graduated by submitting this fascinating thesis called "Through the Valley of Jabal Amil's Shadow."
Yeah, Nightrise is the title, and the subtitle is "Through the Valley of Jabal Amil's Shadow."
Jabal Amil's Shadow. Yeah. Amil.
Yes.
But then you got to put an accent on top of the A if it's Amil.
There's an apostrophe, if you can see it, like a small thing.
Yeah. I see that. So the apostrophe is supposed to make it the long vowel. Amil.
I mean, yeah, that's how Arabic tries to exist in the English language, I would say.
You said the main title of the thesis is Nightrise. And it begins by documenting a series of night journeys that you have taken. Nightrise. Outline briefly for us, what you were trying to do with all your night rises, and what is Nightrise about?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good place to start is the title, because there's so many nuances embedded in it, right? Like, obviously, when you hear Nightrise, you remember nightfall. And the first thing I was trying to do is almost...
What's the word in Arabic for Nightrise and nightfall?
I think it's like it doesn't have one word. It's something like Nightrise, which say Tlu' al-Layl, like something like that, the rise of night.
The beginning of day is Sahel, no?
Yeah, Fajr and these other...
Yeah. Okay, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for
I'm
me...
I'm starting to interrupt you because I want to be...
Yeah, great. So for me, I mean, what I try to do first with the title, so before we jump into the thesis, is to almost destabilize the semantic bias against the night, right? Because when we say nightfall, if you think about this geographically, that's not necessarily accurate. Both are geographically accurate, both the rise of night and the fall, right, of night. I'm just trying to, start the conversation by saying that there's a bias that's deeply rooted in our language that favors the night or emphasizes or illustrates the night as a negative term, right? I mean, the fall of night versus the rise of the day and the sun, etc., etc.
Yeah, there's definitely a bias in favor of the sun. Yeah,
of course.
So you're so the Nightrise is a made-up word. You have made it up.
Yeah, the Nightrise is in this case something I coined to, let's say, focus on the construction or the social and cultural construction of the night by people who are mostly interacting with or living in or benefiting from the nocturnal landscape.
Got it. So are you interested in dayfall?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, sure, dayfall could work, but I'd rather focus on the rise of night than the fall of the day, just because I'm not saying one is bad and one is good. I'm just
Oh, so
saying,
you want to undo the hierarchy also in that?
yeah, I guess so. I think, we live through and because of very forceful Eurocentric attitudes that uh, frame the night as a negation of the day, right? It's always the day is a place, but the night is a time, right? And for me, I always struggled with this conception of space and time because the day is also a time if you think about it. But when we design, we just design for the day and all its, amazing spatial qualities with the ocular in mind, with what we see, etc. And then the night becomes just an opportunity to aestheticize and perpetuate the forms that we design for the day, right? Even through shadows, etc. And it just reminds me of Khan when he says the sun only knows how beautiful it is when it hits the wall and produces a shadow, right? And for me, what I'm trying to do, or at least what I try to do, is to flip this on its head and say that, perhaps the wall doesn't know how beautiful the shadow is because it's too busy aestheticizing it, right? And there's
Mhm.
so much value in the night, so much oral legacy, so much fascination that we totally forgot about because
So why are you interested in the night? What is it about your biography that draws you to the night? Why do you care?
why do I care about the night? Because I think at one point I was almost having a discussion with, let's say, a professor, and I was just
I
talking.
like that you almost having a discussion. So you didn't really have a discussion,
No, no,
but
no.
you didn't not have a discussion.
Yeah, it stopped somehow because we, let's say, agreed to disagree. But in a way, so he was telling me that why do you want to do a thesis about the night? Like, who cares? The night is just scientifically proven as the absence of the day, right? And that's why we think about it as such, as an absence, etc. Right? Like night or darkness is the absence of light. Hence, why this is how we think about, etc., etc.
Which is completely false because the universe is mostly night. There are sort of occasional flashes of day here and there. Yeah, light. Yeah,
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 I mean, the universe today, even though I guess a few centuries back with the geocentric model, we used to assume that
yeah,
the universe is day and what we're looking at is a dark cloud, right? That's
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
that's
that's wrong. But that's wrong. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it is wrong, and I think these attitudes somehow still are ingrained in the way we think about darkness and light, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
we are heliocentric, no question about it. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So yeah,
So why are you interested in light?
I'm interested in the night because I think for me it's a question of, I hate to say it to reinforce the boundary, but I think it is a question of east and west, right? I think with the birth of artificial illumination in the somewhere in the west in Europe, there are attitudes that have been ingrained in our culture in a way that started with the settlement of the urban elites into the night by framing the night as insecure, etc., etc. Right?
Mhm.
And for me, when we talk about discrimination and these things, we only talk about discrimination spatially, right? We say this place, etc., and this particular location, but we don't necessarily talk about it during the day, right? And for
Mhm.
me, what has been part of the research I'm doing is how the audiences of the day versus the night completely shift and change, and basically how the way we design is actually rejecting this change by perpetuating both the shapes of the day but also the audiences of the day by recycling them through these narratives of safety and security, etc. Uh,
That's right. Yeah, we have over illuminated cities. So
yeah,
kind of in that sense, electricity and light bulbs have been a disaster.
yeah, and if you, I mean,
And they have colonized the night, is what you're saying.
colonize the night and gentrify the night, and that's true. And when we talk about, this neighborhood is not illuminated and this neighborhood is illuminated, etc. When I think back, I realized this is an outcome of the fact that we decided to illuminate particular neighborhoods. The contrast became way more prevalent when particular cities and streets became extremely illuminated while others stayed as
Yeah. But why do you still care about all these? Like, you haven't cut to the chase. Why does Mohamad Nahleh care about all this?
I know you want a specific answer, but I don't know. I mean, it's I think there are so many things that happen instinctively, and this is one of them. And it's totally linked to COVID in a way, and my decision to escape my bedroom in Cambridge and go on this walk in Lebanon from south to north for a month, right? And when I decided to venture on this walk, there was never a reason for it. There was never, oh, I'm interested in night because this and that and that and that.
So you
Right?
decided to walk from south to north of Lebanon
Yeah,
at night,
at night.
just on an instinctive lark.
Yeah, and that was actually one day after the explosion. So we have
One day after the explosion, the big explosion.
Yeah.
And your mother was injured in that explosion, wasn't she?
Yes. Yeah.
So she must have been in hospital or something, or
No, we all moved to the countryside in the south, which is where I started my journey and continued all the way north.
Now the explosion was in Beirut.
Yeah.
Now you were further south, way south.
Yeah, so we have a house somewhere in the south, and the reason we moved is because at the beginning of the explosion, when it happened, we thought there were chemicals in the air. Like we thought the air was going to be poisonous, and so actually many people left because it's ammonium nitrate. Everyone was saying it's a mushroom cloud, it's a chemical explosion, etc., etc.
So it created some real fear in Beirut about long-term environmental impacts of the explosion.
Yeah, of course, but yeah, definitely
enough for you to move.
For those who, let's say, were privileged enough, when we talk about COVID, Lebanon was doing fine up until the explosion happened. But then when everyone was on the street, placing the state in a way, right? Because the state doesn't exist and basically committed this genocide. Everyone was on the streets, cleaning the streets, and everyone infected each other, etc. And this is where the cases multiplied, and this is something we're still trying to recover from even today. But yeah, I mean, yeah, we did move to our house in the south, and this is where I decided, I need to leave because I need to, I don't know why, it just happened I need to leave and only walk at night, because there was this almost a remedy or a serenity to the night that, I wanted to explore further. But still, for a while, I've been interested in how the bias we have, the temporal bias we have in relation to architecture. So architecture was such a secondary basic thing in my mind. It was never the main issue. But then as I was walking, it sort of came back instinctively through the stories of particular people I was encountering on the walk. But now, I guess, looking back in hindsight, if I think about the walk, and I think about how much of a hypocrite I felt when I started the walk, looking for the serenity of nature after a tough explosion, I realized, like very hypocritical, because I was looking for this painting of nature and not nature itself, because I never knew what nature is living in the city, studying in the city, right? So there was this need for nature as an aesthetic consumption that I was searching for right after the explosion, transformed into becoming, what the thesis is, by leveraging the night itself, where actually you can't see the aestheticized consumption and agrarian capitalism and the beautiful greenery. On the other hand, you smell the manure, and you learn that this is also nature, but this is not the nature you've been taught to appreciate in your in architecture school, when you render beautiful buildings with nice green trees, etc. Right?
but you ran into a lot of life, right? Usually the night is associated with clandestine activity.
That's what I thought. I thought I'm gonna encounter one person per night maximum, and they're gonna I don't know, follow me, etc. But the most shocking discovery was that it's actually filled with life. There are so many encounters, so many mundane practices, right? Like the butcher preparing the meat, the farmer, watering the plants to avoid evaporation because they sweat during the day and it's summer and they can't afford to use so much water, etc., etc., right? Like there are so many almost banal things that the night makes prominent. I guess this is where the discovery started to happen. That the night can be supernatural, but it can also be super boring and super normal and super etc. And the reason,
Supernatural? You mean, what do you mean by supernatural?
like metaphysical, and
Yeah,
if
yeah, okay.
back into how the fascination civilizations had with the night, and
Right.
Neith and the goddess of night that scared Zeus, etc., etc. These things that still exist until today. So yeah, the night for me was capable of both of these realms, and this is where I found fascination, and this is how the night started to just have value in the way I think about design and architecture. But then COVID was always existing within this conversation. The way I started relating to COVID is with this issue of, let's say, over sanitation, right? The hygiene, and how now society was almost too clean and too ocular and too much about what we see and what we have to see, etc. I was walking at a time when I felt the entire world was going against what I'm starting to believe in, which is that it's okay not to see particular things, particular practices, particular corners of houses. It was also at a time where I was, obviously in Lebanon and still connecting on Zoom to, let's say, the Western clock, MIT, and you ultimately link back to the East and how the entire night workers, at least in the phone industry, their entire lives have been regimented to serve the Western clock, right? I mean, when I call customer service here in the US and someone in, I don't know, India answers me, it's because this person is, basically switching their lives to follow a clock that is not in their own home country, right?
Right.
So in a way, you start to be more sensitive about these things and the value of night and who makes time and which time do we follow, right? And what does it mean? How is time in the city different than time in the countryside, right? And who's the audience of the night, and why do we not think about these audiences when we, start to design architecture?
What are your thoughts on how does one design? Historically, is there any architecture that is? What is your example of night architecture?
I mean, if you Google night architecture now, you're gonna find shapes of the day with nice lights and nice moods and
Oh,
nice
yeah.
right? So there's this commodification that is called night design that has become part of how we design. So for me, this is the opposite of what I'm trying to do. I don't think there's a precedent precisely, but I know there are so many things I didn't want to do in this thesis. One of them is add lights to make it night, especially in a place where that's suffering from the lack of electricity. Right. I think one of the most transformative encounters was with this farmer who was basically telling me what potentially be a project for the night, right? And he was just asking me, what's the opposite of a lighthouse? Or how can we design something that does not emphasize the lack of electricity? That at the opposite actually embraces it and designs something that understands that the lack of electricity or darkness can also have spatial qualities.
Yes.
Right? And for me, this was the like, let's say, the key to starting to understand the night not as nothingness, because this is how we've been taught to appreciate it, as nothingness, as formlessness. But the opposite, trying to find what are the forms of the night, what kind of space or architecture can exist if we use the night as a place and not as just time. And this is where so many things started to happen, right? Like, and most importantly, who visits the space, or who visits the space at?
Before we go to use, what are the forms of the night if they are not illuminated daytime forms? What is the character of a night form?
So for me, when I talk about Nightrise, I don't see it as an opposition to the day. I see it simply as the continuation of the first shadow, right? So when I think about it, I don't think there's day and then shadow and then night, and then the shadow is part of the day, and then the night
Right.
is, I see the night as one point in time that is, let's say, the biggest shadow that actually our eyes can no longer appreciate because we've been accustomed to, obsessively accustomed to artificial lighting. So when you think about Nightrise and night, not as a static point in time, but as a moment of transition and transformation, and not only of the physical space, but also, as I'm saying, of the culture landscape, this is where you can start thinking of shapes and forms that I guess emphasize this transformation. So again, what started as an appreciation of night in itself ultimately transformed into an appreciation of this transformation from day to night and from night to day, etc. Right? So this is why it's the thesis is Nightrise. It's not night. It's again a process of transformation, political, cultural, geographical, with moonlight, right?
Mhm.
Like there's so many things we forgot about, and that you like it's easy to talk about and say I was walking for the countryside at night, but when you think about it, there are points in time when I was crawling because there's no moonlight out of fear of falling on a cliff. So there's an entire culture of doing that, right? Like if there are so many shepherds I met on the walk who actually, you know, follow particular trees at night without seeing them, just to know where their path is.
What does this mean, follow particular trees
Like
without seeing them?
like they actually plant particular trees on particular path, and because of the smell of trees on this particular path, they know where they're going.
Ah,
Right?
right. Smell. So
Smell.
smell becomes an important thing.
Yeah, smell, for example. So let's say
Smell
that
works just as well at night as
uh,
day
yeah, and it's heightened perhaps more at night when let's
because
say
yeah,
yeah.
because the eyes don't dominate as much.
Yes, precisely. And I guess that was a main concern for me is what happens when we start to obsess less with this seemingly instinctive relationship between eyesight and insight, and realize that perhaps they are not as connected as the Eurocentric model has convinced us. You know, what if, I mean, there's a reason why there's a space between sight and the metaphorical understanding of sight in terms of intelligence and vision, etc., that doesn't exist when we talk about other senses. Like the nose doesn't have as much metaphor behind it as
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
touch doesn't have as much metaphors about it.
So, what's your nose like? Do you have a good nose? I mean, smell wise.
I want to say better than when I started.
Yeah, because like they said, like sommeliers, people who do wine, etc., you have a great
Yeah.
nose. And earlier, before electrification, I imagine, nose was an important ability.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the industrialization of artificial lighting. I mean, if we talk about the effects, they're crazy.
Yeah. No, I don't want to talk about that. I want to stay with the nose. I'm more interested in the
Yeah.
nose. Now, what about the ear? The ear is. Does the ear work just as well?
Of course, yeah, definitely. I mean, the ear, let's say, with the call to prayer of the mosque and the bell of the church, especially at dawn,
Yeah.
this becomes a really important way of understanding direction, right? And this is something I got to experience
Right.
when I was with people who, almost listen and follow the call to prayer to return home, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
they call their dog and the dog answers, and then they know which direction to go. I mean, there are so many minor events that happen that start to show that there is an alternative way of understanding the world that is not just related to seeing and not seeing, and what is the shadow on the wall, and these things.
So, what did you do? Now, you went on several different walks in several different regions, right? I mean, you started from the south, then you stopped. Is this all about night only as a phenomena, as a human universal, human phenomena, or is this something about Lebanon, Beirut, Arabic culture, male culture? What is this? What are the other things your thesis interacts with?
So I guess when I started the walk, I assumed it was gonna be, this romantic, we're all linked through the human understanding of night, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was completely the opposite. right? There is a human understanding of night.
Right.
There are things we agree on, all of us.
Yeah.
There are fears that we think are instinctive, that at some point in our evolution became instinctive, but weren't, that we still have today. But there are also specificities to places,
Right.
right? And for me, the walk was almost a heavy thing to do because my family is originally from the south,
Uh-huh.
right? And they lived in the south up until the Israeli occupation, which lasted until 2000. So I was actually the first or second generation that was born and raised and educated in the city.
Uh-huh.
So I never got to visit the South in a way that my parents relate to. So this was the first time I started a walk alone in a place without the support of my family, or being taken to places by my family, and just trying to understand the South through the question of the night.
Mhm.
Right? And I tried as much as possible, because for me it was a bit too much to negotiate and have a conversation with thesis, with the night, with the exclusion, but also go back to my childhood and think about, what does the Israeli occupation mean? What does it mean to go back to the city? All of these questions. So I actually, on purpose, when I was doing the walk, I did not pass by the village that my family was born and raised in, and I just continued walking.
Why didn't you go into the village?
Because it was like I would never went there before alone,
So
and
this would have been a perfect time to go. Why didn't you go?
it was just a bit too heavy for me to do that. There were so many things
Too
happening.
heavy meaning too much emotional baggage.
Yeah, too much emotional baggage after the explosion, with an imminent thesis, with not knowing what to do in life, and now to go back to the past when the future is still this much uncertain, wasn't necessarily the a thing I felt comfortable doing. Even though I randomly found this farmer on the walk who actually took me to this village because he realized that my family name is from this particular village, and hence how now jumping to the end of the thesis, the
Yeah.
path designing is basically in this particular village. But so I mean, yeah, in the south, because of the history, so much of the oral legacy and oral culture talks about stories that are nocturnal. One of them is the story of the Israeli airplane that passes at night, that has become one of the legends, or grafted into one woman in this particular village that used to traumatize children. This woman was called Kamel, MK, and then the Israeli plane was called MK as well. So whenever the Israeli plane comes in at night, even today, because we still have surveillance missions, everyone is like, MK is here, Kamel just came, you should hide at home, right?
Yeah.
So this is just one example of how the night can try to acquire even a political dimension in a place that is very specific, that has very specific qualities to it, right? And then,
Mhm.
like, if we talk about Lebanon south to north, I was basically walking from predominantly Muslim or Shia Muslim neighborhoods, or
Mhm. Mhm.
Christian villages, predominantly Christian villages at the top. So even this change from the call to prayer at the mosque to the bed of the church was happening somewhere, on this walk.
But the projects that you created out of this, you have a sundial, right? You have something like a cave, a kind of a
Yeah,
above ground cave. Is
some,
that
yeah,
something like that? Yeah.
yeah.
And the cave feels like a series of eggs, kind of egg-like spaces. They have a kind of a womb-like quality to them, a series of wombs.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about this, particularly which connect to the Big Dipper, I think, or something like that. What is the thinking behind this?
Yeah, I mean, I want to put it a bit in context before saying that the project I did for thesis is twofold. Like one part is focusing and retelling the stories, and the other part is designing what I call the path of Nightrise. For me, the path of Nightrise came as an outcome of conversations with the municipality of the village I was talking about, to actually link a valley, to actually link a mountain and a river through a valley. And for me, this is where the question came, how can I use Nightrise as a way to design this path, right? To actually test what is the form of the night on this particular path. How can the night actually produce form and shape in this valley, right? And so for me, the first issue was the question of first, blindness, architecture. How can we first challenge the unidirectionality of the usual, let's say, landscape path by proposing something that is a bit more free, right? That is a bit more about imagination, not just about being forced by a rail to, follow an incision in the landscape and go in it. So for me, the question became, how can the path of Nightrise not only bring back the question of blindness and imagination and using blindness as a mirror to your inner let's say thoughts and thought processes, but also how can we start to freeze some of the stories in the oral legacy of the village. And for thesis I did propose 4 stations.
Freeze some of the stories? Freeze?
Yes.
Freeze? What do you mean by freeze?
I mean, freeze, I mean spatialize. And I think this is a key point for the thesis, because we're talking about a place, when we talk about first south of Lebanon, we're not just simply talking about the south of Lebanon geographically. It's actually because we're talking about the south of Beirut, right? The capital. And South Lebanon, and historically known as Jabal Amil, has always been an annex to Beirut, right? It is physically the place where agriculture is feeding the mountain and the capital, but also the place that was in a way left alone to defend itself against, the Israeli occupation later on. And this is very recent, right? I mean, this is also the place that was predominantly Shi'i during the Ottoman rule, which was pretty much Sunni, which actually suffered from its schools being burned, its libraries being burned, its education being threatened, etc., etc. So when I talk about oral legacy, I talk about a legacy that is actually oral, not randomly, but because this no longer has written accounts to legitimize it. I say freeze some of these stories. It needs to be understood as a way of resisting these many forces that have attempted to erase the history of this place, right? Be it the Ottomans through, as I said, Al-Jazzar, who came and, eradicated some of the libraries, or later on the Israeli occupation, etc. And the French Mandate, of course, later on, that came and created Lebanese nationalism as an urban and coastal story, and framed the hinterland and the south of Lebanon as an annex to it, right? So you have so many forces, European, Israeli, Ottoman, that have attempted forcefully for centuries to erase the history of this place. The way I was using night politically is to spatialize the path in a particular way that will spatialize these stories and bring them into existence in a way that becomes, in a way, a library, right? A library of stories. And this is where the idea of the stations came from, that the path is not a line, but a sequence of stations, each telling one chapter of the story of this place. Be it recently through the story of Kamel and the airplane, or if
Are you using the word stations through biblical reference, or what do you mean?
No, I'm using the word station on purpose.
Or as in gas station.
I wish there were gas stations now with the fuel shortage in Lebanon. But I'm using the word station in a way to say that one cannot stand on its own. It's always part of the path. When you visit a station, it's different than the word I hate, which is intervention, as if architecture is surgically making something that can stand on its own, right? In this case, none of the stations are sustainable. They all need to be understood as a path that tells this entire book of stories of Jabal Amil.
So it's sort of a critique of the word site, because site is sort of self-contained, almost. Yeah.
Okay. And I feel that there's no better critique of the word sight than to critique it within the discourse of the night, right? Because you can't really see the static sight, which is very much diurnal, right? The idea of a
Right.
sight being one place and one thing in time, right?
Mhm.
And I think, again, bringing back this question of blindness is really important, especially as it relates to Jabal Amil, but also to Islam. I mean, in Islam, the question of blindness is very much important, especially when we talk about aniconism and iconoclasm and these different things, right?
How is that connected to blindness? I don't get it. Iconoclasm, how is that blindness?
Well, I think it's always this question of looking at the world through imagination, not just simply through obsessively searching for the material.
What your eyes can see.
Yeah, not what your
So
eyes.
icons are considered to be eye-centric.
Yes, yes, very very much ocular, very much something you
I
see
see.
precisely.
So blindness is like a non-seeing, not with your eyes. It's
Exactly.
not a deprivation. It's a sort of an opening up to another world.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Without pretending that I'm this pious Muslim,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
recently, let's say, I'm beginning to understand, and I think it's not unnatural that Borges, as he was, he was becoming blind as he was, growing up, and his use of Islam as a not as a historical religion, but as a way of representing the world is not accidental, right? Like Borges uses Islam almost as a theology to argue or to be, in a way, to feel that it's okay to become blind because blindness can be a gift, not just a way of.
Borges, the writer. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you also think of Beethoven becoming deaf. Milton became blind also. He wrote a poem on his blindness. But Milton saw it quite as a handicap, I think. But anyway, you were saying Borges used blindness as an asset. How are you connecting that to Islam?
So, I mean, many of the stories that Borges uses employ Muslim painters, employ Muslim places, etc. And I
Is
guess,
that right?
yeah, and I guess one of my favorite stories, or one of the stories that was most transformative, is the story of the painter Tafas.
Uh-huh.
So basically, the painter Tafas, as Borges says, is a Muslim painter who
Right.
actually takes goes to cafes and picks very realistic postcards of places, and then he goes home and puts these on a canvas, and
Yeah.
then takes black shoe polish and paints over them, and then puts a label with the name of the place and exhibits them. And I guess what Borges is saying here is that this is very much up to the viewer to imagine the place and to construct an image of what the place is, instead of surrendering to what he would say is the easier way of looking or spatializing or imagining a particular place. And I think that the funniest part of in all of this is, if we think about Borges, he wouldn't necessarily name this abstract art. He would probably say this is Islamic realism. Because this is very much, a true depiction of the way Islam looks at the world. Right?
Interesting. I do meditation, and I've done meditation practices. And meditation begins by closing your eyes. You don't want to meditate really with your eye. Well, if you're a really advanced meditator, you can meditate with your eyes open. But for ordinary people, you close your eyes. So to think about this, of course, it's a technology of the sexualization of the female body. But I wonder if there's an alternate reading of it via a technology of blindness, as you are saying, which certainly also connects to other insights. Another professor I used to really respect at Cornell, whenever he was listening to lectures, which didn't have slides, just philosophy or theory lectures, he'd close his eyes. He says that helps me listen better.
I mean, in the case of meditation, what you're talking about is almost blindness as a way to enter the soul, right?
For enlightenment.
Yeah,
You can't get enlightenment without becoming blind.
yeah, and enlightenment and this question of light is very, very funny, actually.
Yeah, it's the wrong word, right? So for instance, nirvana, the word in Sanskrit
Yeah.
for what we call enlightenment, is taking out the light. Nirva means to blow out the light. So it's kind of like a darkness that you are talking about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me and for Borges and for me as someone understanding Islam recently, for me at this point in time, I'm more interested in it as an allegorical mode of representation, not necessarily a historical religion that I know a lot about.
Right.
And this is how I'm using it in the path of Nightrise, right? At least as a way that can actually almost break the ice and help connect the path to the context which it is embedded in.
All right. So you're going to tell us about your wombs.
The the cave, you mean?
Yes. I read them as wombs.
The caves is one of the different stations on the path. And it all started for me with a very important and a proverb that I didn't know existed, which is translated to English would say, look under any stone in Jabal Amil and you will find a poet. And obviously, as I explained earlier, this cannot be dissociated from the history of attempting to erase the scholarly production and literary production of the scholars in Jabal Amil. At first, I understand this proverb as an act of resistance to what is happening.
Yeah.
But in the context of thesis, look under any stone in Jabal Amil. There's the question of darkness under the stone that is essential to the discovery of the poet. And for me, this is how it all opens up together, right? Look under any stone in Jabal Amil and you will find a poet. But this needs to be understood again within the framework of religion and Islam, not as a threat, right? Not as an invitation to come and prove and flip every stone and discover or not that there's a poet, but it's an invitation for trust, to believe that even if you cannot see under every stone, you should have trust that under this particular stone or the other particular stone, you will find a poet. And for me, within the context of the valley and Jabal Amil and the mountain and the path of Nightrise, I started understanding the mountain itself as a stone, and the valley.
That's great, amazing, yeah.
And the valley itself as the space under the stone.
Yeah.
And obviously, the space under the stone has so many Islamic connotations, as the cave, basically, right? The cave where the Prophet, first had in the Mount Hira.
The revelation, yeah.
Revelation. But also another story which I found really relevant to the villagers of this particular village called Taibe is a surah in the Quran called the Companions of the Cave. And the Companions of the Cave is the same as the story of the seven sleepers, which is mentioned before. I don't know if you know it, but it talks about seven men who basically were escaping prosecution and escaped into a cave and slept for one night and woke up, and they discovered that they had been sleeping for 309 years, and that Christianity had already entered the world, etc., and then they discovered they're in a new world.
Right.
But for me, within the context of this particular station and this particular proverb, I look at the distinction between the seven sleepers and the way that the surah is explained in the Quran. In the Quran, the question of blindness becomes prevalent because the Quran says that we should not care about how many sleepers there are. So the Quran never mentions how many there are. It also never mentions where the story took place and who the sleepers were, etc., etc. So the ambiguity in the Quran, the blindness, the question of non-representation, of surrendering to the unseen and the unknown, and relinquishing any need to obsess over the material answers and the numbers and etc. became, sort of embedded within this question of the darkness under the stone, right? This trust that there's no need to understand how many sleepers there are to appreciate let's say, the importance of the story, in the same way that there's no need to flip every stone to understand that there's a poet under every stone. And this is still within, a very general, like I'm talking about it very generally, but in the thesis, there are smaller chapters that talk about the space of the cave, as it is mentioned, the way it is open to the north and to the east, and etc. But also the way the sleepers turn, and I mean, it's a very, very difficult, very, very, detailed, let's say, description. But for the purpose of our conversation, to return to the wombs that you talk about,
Right.
this is basically, again, from an other oral story that I also encountered, which is the way the seven sleepers are connected to the seven stars in the Big Dipper. There's this story in Jabal Amil that every night the seven stars of the Big Dipper come down to the cave, wherever it is, the cave of the seven sleepers, and become the sleepers. And then during the morning, the opposite happens. So for me, there was, again, a reason to spatialize and freeze this connection. So how can the space under the cave, which is the space under the mountain, become linked to the constellation of the Big Dipper and the seven stars? And actually, each of these wombs that you talk about, each curvature follows the orbit of one of the stars as you see it from this particular village at this particular point in time, right? So this is how the shape of the wombs comes in, right?
All right. So, Mohamad, as we are coming to an end, yeah, we're almost at the end of our conversation here. Before we started recording, you were telling me about your mother, who was unfortunately injured in part of the big explosion. And then you were talking to me about this village in the south,
Yeah.
which is your ancestral village, which you are connected with your last name, but which you didn't go to. But then you were taken to anyway, and then you build a path around it. And now we are talking about the womb, and of course you are here at MIT, a long way from home. And what is the search in all of this? Looking through this sort of, my armchair psychoanalysis perspective, what is the emotional imperative of this project for you? When you look back at it, don't tell me about what you think you were doing and not what you presented for your thesis defense.
Yeah.
Now that it's all done and put aside, can Mohamad talk to Mohamad and say, this is what you were doing? How would you critique? How would you
That's a big
produce
question.
a critique of your own work?
I think it's not random that I needed to go outside Beirut to be able to look back at Jabal Amil, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that whenever I was studying at the American University of Beirut, I never had an inclination to go back to my, the village of my ancestors and parents and study it, right? I think that the fact that I joined MIT, and with COVID and everything happening, something was born in me that led me to go back and explore parts of me that I never explored before, right? And I don't know, like, this is a point in my career where I'm trying to invent myself, right? This is not a point where I'm talking here today in a way to reflect on a career or to tell you my opinion about a career where I'm, is well established to talk about, right? This is a point where I think I will look back at this in 5 years and use it as a sense of accountability to say, oh shit, I mean, this is how I was thinking, and this is how things have changed, and am I still honest to the person that at this point in time wanted a career that is embedded in south of Lebanon and in Jabal Amil and in this particular history and at this particular point in time, right? And I feel, this is why I think this thesis has been really transformative for me. I mean, honestly, more so than the question of night and all of these academic questions in terms of architecture, etc., etc. These are sure important, and I'm happy to explore them further. But for me, the most transformative was this idea of, I'm not sure how to put it into words, but this idea of, almost going back home to a home that you never knew existed in a way. Even though my home was the city, it's not coincidental that when I was walking for the first time at night, etc., I still had a sense of comfort, knowing that my claim for being in the South is legitimized by a history that is the history of my family. And especially now, looking at the South and realizing that there's no architecture, whatever architecture means. People are not attached to spaces, they're seriously just attached to land, because they've been taught to not attach or engrave meaning to space because it can be destroyed at any point in time by different actors on the borders or elsewhere. And so for me, it just feels like a duty and a responsibility, and the thesis fits within this idea of almost reproving or re-explaining why the discipline of architecture matters beyond designing spaces and putting them on sites and saying this is architecture and this is an arch and this is a long window, not a square window as you've been taught to assume, but using architecture for a cultural reason, in this case really freezing and spatializing these stories, again, as I said, as a way of resisting the different, let's say, forces that have attempted to erase this history. So for me, again, it's this question of non-urgency. And I think the non-urgent, urgent project is something I've been recently fascinated in, right? Like architecture and urgency and climate change and, etc. have been really at the center of how we think about space and architecture. And I think in this case, the reason why we don't think an architectural project is important in the south of Lebanon, because I personally have been convinced that the south of Lebanon is not worth spending time on an architecture project until recently going there and discovering that perhaps there's a different narrative to that. I mean, just to maybe conclude, non-urgency, now I realize in retrospect, is also the colonizers' power. To even frame the disappearing education or intellectual production in Jabal Amil as something that is not worth exploring, and that it's okay if people don't react or don't have a connection to architecture is fine. I mean, it's not fine, right? This is something that doesn't need to be the prevalent mode of relating to space in Jabal Amil. And I think this is where I'm trying to invent a role for myself in this particular location.
I mean, I think the search for roots and the search for home, in one sense, is also an effort to decolonize or to the struggle for self-decolonization, right? I mean, which is a difficult work and not easily done and probably never fully successful, but is a project that certainly people like you and me, who are kind of here in the centers of the West, struggle with. Mohamad, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation with me on Architecture Talk.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.